When they started digging a hole in a parking lot in Leicester, England last August, archaeologists weren't expecting very much. But what they unearthed has caught the world's attention. A skeleton that fits the description of King Richard III, a man whose body has been missing since the Middle Ages. As Sean Mallon reports, the king's great-nephew, a Canadian, is now the key to solving this 500-year-old mystery.
The story begins half a millennium ago on an English field. Two armies clash. Henry Tudor, soon to be Henry VII, wins the battle and the throne of England. King Richard III is killed, but he loses more than his life and his crown. The new rulers also make sure his reputation is trashed.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
William Shakespeare, for one, portrays Richard as a scoundrel, a murderous hunchback.
Since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these farewell-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain.
History paints him as the most notorious of English kings. But another indignity awaits. His remains are lost. Until this past summer, some old bones are found under a parking lot in the city of Leicester. Could they be the remains of the long-lost Richard? The answer lies with a distant descendant from across the sea. Canadian Michael Ibsen, the king's 17th generation nephew.
It's a very, very strange feeling to be here.
For a historian, it doesn't get much better than that.
No, I mean, it's just incredible, absolutely incredible.
To reconstruct the whole incredible story, a good place to start is the Tower of London. Now a popular tourist stop, but in medieval times, the home of kings, and the place where Richard was suspected of killing his young nephews to claim the throne. A great story, but lousy history, says John Ashdown Hill.
I don't think we have any real evidence about the fate of the princes, and we don't have any solid evidence that they died.
The author of books on Richard III, Ashdown Hill, says his true nature was much more nuanced than that of Shakespeare's villain.
I don't think that anybody is black or white. Richard III was an aristocrat, a member of the royal family, and eventually a king in the 15th century. You have to see him in that period.
Historians may not be certain about Richard's character, but we do know how he died. On August 22nd, 1485, at a place in the center of England called Bosworth Field, where today a farmer grows wheat and beans.
So you're effectively now in the middle of the site of the Battle of Bosworth.
Richard Mackinder makes his living studying and explaining that battle when Richard III's forces faced the army of Henry Tudor.
Richard charged into battle against Henry, nearly mano a mano. He was driven back some 100 yards or 600 yards potentially. From there, back to a marsh where he lost his horse, tried to fight on foot, and then was eventually brought down.
Brought down, the story goes, with a poleaxe to the head delivered by a Welsh soldier. After the battle, Richard's body was thrown over the back of a horse, brought here to the center of Leicester, and put on display for a couple of days. That was the way things worked in the Middle Ages. The new king needed to prove to the people that the old king was, in fact, dead. Richard was buried under the floor of a church that was later destroyed in the time of Henry VIII, and that's where things get murky. One story said his bones were then taken out and thrown into the River Soar. A weathered plaque records that event. Another one right beside says it's not true. And so for generations, the king's body remained somewhere beneath Leicester, his resting place unmarked and unknown. Until history buffs approached the city with an outrageous idea to dig up a section of this parking lot that might have been built over the old church.
I made no secret of the fact that I thought it was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that we would find the remains of Richard III.
Archaeologist Richard Buckley of the University of Leicester was brought in to head the team.
I think I'm recorded as saying I would eat my hat if we found the remains of Richard III.
First came ground-probing radar to locate the perimeter of the old church. In August, they started excavating, and within days they found something. Buckley called in the university's bone expert, Joe Appleby.
He told me that they had come across human remains on the site, which is not necessarily that surprising, but that I needn't worry because it wasn't going to be Richard III, but could I come down and excavate them nonetheless?
Dressed in full mask and gown to avoid contaminating the bones, Appleby went to work. The feet were missing, but she uncovered the hips and then started working up the spine.
It really wasn't until right at that last part of the excavation process that I suddenly realised that we had a find that was very significant indeed.
You had to search around to find it because it wasn't in a straight line.
Absolutely.
Here, on a different skeleton with a similar spinal deformity, she showed me what she uncovered.
That must have been a oh my moment.
It certainly was. I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, and I started to think that we might have found the right skeleton.
What she saw was scoliosis, or curvature of the spine, very much like historical descriptions of King Richard.
Your reaction to that was?
Disbelief, really, I think, because as an archaeologist, I just don't expect to find something, that obvious. I was expecting it to be a normal skeleton.
That was the first thing that made us gasp. This individual would have had his left shoulder slightly lower than his right, which is actually what the 15th century writer John Rouse had said about Richard III. He didn't say he had a hump, he said his left shoulder was lower than his right.
And then they uncovered more stunning evidence.
When we got up to the head, to the skull, you could see immediately that this person had died a violent death with blows to the skull.
It's an area of the bone's been taken off around here.
So it's about that size?
Yeah, quite a large piece of bone's been taken off completely. This is not something that happens just by chance. This is a very strong area of the skull.
In other words, the man had died violently in battle. The team even found the point of an arrowhead beside the spine. Richard Buckley, the skeptic, now realized that they may well have made an extraordinary discovery.
Ultimately, all of those characteristics of the sort of burial, its position in the church, evidence of disability, evidence of trauma to the skull, all sort of add up to it being the right individual. And it would be rather a coincidence to find another individual who had all of these characteristics.
The Leicester University team called in the media. Richard Taylor is director of the school's corporate affairs.
We are not saying today that we have found King Richard III. What we are saying is that the search for Richard III has entered a new phase.
They choose their words carefully, but still, their discovery caused an international sensation.
You must think you found it.
I would say it's a prime candidate, certainly.
But there was one more important piece of business. To confirm that the remains were really Richard III, they needed the DNA of a living descendant. And that's how a soft-spoken Canadian furniture maker comes into this story.
I'm intrigued and really utterly fascinated to see what the results will show.
Next on 16 by 9, will royal blood and Canadian veins unlock the mystery of a medieval king?
Two men separated by 5 centuries. A middle-class Canadian visits the spot where his distant uncle became the last king of England to die in battle. His name is Michael Ibsen. With him is Richard Mackinder, an expert on the events that transpired here.
I think I'm somewhat lost for words, really, to be standing here 500 years later, looking down on the exact spot where Richard was killed.
16x9 invited Michael Ibsen for his first visit to Bosworth Field, where King Richard III died. But what really brought him here was a convergence of genealogy, archaeology, and pure luck. Historian John Ashdown Hill played a key role. A decade ago, he set himself the task of tracing the female descendants of Anne of York, elder sister of Richard III.
The all-female lines continued quite well down to the 19th century, and there were a number of living descendants in the 19th century who then irritatingly didn't get married, or got married very late, or only had sons.
Finally, he found one unbroken female line down to a woman named Joy Ibsen, born in England, a retired journalist living in London, Ontario. She was Michael Ibsen's mother. Ashdown Hill called her.
And I think she was amazed because it was a family tree that took her back not just to Richard III's sister in the House of York, but to the Emperor Charlemagne.
And what did she think about it?
Well, I think she was tremendously pleased, really, being a strong monarchist at heart and very proud of her British heritage.
Joy Ibsen died in 2008. 4 years later, archaeologists make a startling discovery under a parking lot in Leicester. A skeleton similar to this one with a curved spine and a damaged skull, a tantalizing fit with the story of Richard III. It was bone specialist Joe Appleby who extracted the remains.
In your heart, you must think it's him.
Some of the time I wake up in the middle of the night wondering whether maybe it isn't. So I think that really we just have to wait for the evidence to come through and see what that says.
The evidence is inside Michael Ibsen, a DNA link back to the medieval king. The university research team contacted him at his London furniture-making business.
The reality of what it might mean for us, I think, hadn't quite sunk in.
So this is a spit kit. So what I need you to do is to spit into this tube.
It's another Canadian, geneticist Turi King, a native of Vancouver, who will be comparing Ibsen's DNA with that of the skeleton.
It's absolutely fantastic. So, I mean, I do a lot of work on genetic genealogy, but never usually involving somebody of potentially this background or of this importance, I suppose.
Getting Ibsen's DNA was as easy as spitting. Getting DNA from the 500-year-old remains is much trickier. To do it, King extracted 2 teeth from the skull, which she'll analyze at a clean lab like this one. It's hoped that they will contain the type of DNA handed down through the female line, DNA that's more plentiful and durable than that of the male.
What happens is the teeth are crushed. They are cleaned completely, and then they're crushed to a powder, and then you extract the DNA from that powder.
So he's not getting his teeth back, sadly.
No, he's not, I'm afraid.
This is not the Richard DNA, but this is very much what it's going to look like.
Yeah, so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be getting basically a DNA sequence from Michael, and then hopefully from the skeletal remains, and then looking to see if they match.
It's almost like a bit like a jigsaw puzzle.
It
You
is.
literally little chunks.
Little
yes?
chunks, and then you start to look for bits where the chunks overlap, and that allows you to align the sequence up.
Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful.
It could take months to get an answer. Meanwhile, bone expert Joe Appleby will be examining the skeleton, which could also be revealing.
Will we know what he looked like?
We hope that we will. We plan to do a facial reconstruction, so we hope that we will, at the end of the process, be able to see what Richard III looked like, assuming it's him.
More than 500 years after his death, then, we may have a real portrait of the king. Philippa Langley of the Richard III Society, the driving force behind the archaeological project, says she has even higher hopes.
The whole reason for this journey and the whole reason for the search for the remains of Richard III was always to get to the real man, not the Tudor myth.
But the scientists say that while they may be able to identify the man, science cannot tell us what kind of man he was.
Sadly, this will not. His character is not written onto the skeleton.
So the remains won't settle the question of whether Richard was the villain Shakespeare made him out to be. But he may have been a victim of medieval bigotry, because this was a time when a disability was seen as evidence of an evil nature. However, history finally judges Richard The bones have people talking about an age-old mystery.
In the end, it's a question of, do you believe it or not?
And you?
I think we're already close to having enough evidence. I believe that the bones are Richard III.
One footnote to the story: if the skeleton is indeed Richard, the world may never see it. It'll be reburied in Leicester, where there's already an inscription on the cathedral floor. And the most notorious, or perhaps most unjustly defamed, of English kings might finally get a proper royal burial. And there's a good chance his Canadian nephew, of royal blood and 17 generations removed, will be there in a place of honor.
And that is our broadcast for tonight. I'm Carolyn Jarvis. From all of us here at 16 by 9, thanks for watching and have a great weekend.